November 24, 1944. The skies over Japan change forever. Before dawn on November 24, 1944, a new chapter in the air war over the Pacific began. From freshly constructed runways at North Field on Tinian and Isley Field on Saipan, the 21st Bomber Command launched its first full-scale strategic assault on the Japanese homeland. 111 Boeing B-29 Superfortresses lifted off in formation, their polished aluminum fuselages glinting faintly in the tropical morning light. At their head, Brigadier General Haywood Hansell, directing from his headquarters on Guam, oversaw the operation that would demonstrate a technological leap Japan was unprepared to confront. The target, the Nakajima Aircraft Company's massive Musashino engine plant, a critical component of Japan's dwindling aviation industry on the outskirts of Tokyo. The bombers carried a combined payload of 277 tons, metal and explosives that would soon test the limits of Japan's air defenses and its faith in conventional warfare. At Chofu Airfield, west of Tokyo, Captain Tatsuo Yamada prepared for what was expected to be a high-altitude interception unlike any before. As his ground crew fueled his Kawasaki K-61 Hien, Yamada reviewed the latest briefing. Intelligence officers had warned that the enemy bombers were operating at extraordinary heights, far above the levels where Japanese fighters normally fought. The goal was simple in theory, but daunting in practice: intercept the incoming formation before it reached the capital. Donning his oxygen mask, Yamada tightened his harness and taxied to the runway. His Hien, armed with 4 12.7mm machine guns and 2 20mm cannons, was an agile and reliable aircraft within its operational limits. But this mission would push those limits beyond anything the Japanese Army Air Force had yet faced. In earlier years, Japanese pilots had gained valuable experience engaging American bombers over China. Those opponents, B-24 Liberators and older B-17 Flying Fortresses, operated between 20,000 and 25,000 feet, altitudes well within reach of Japan's nimble interceptors. Major Teiichi Maeda, one of Japan's foremost air tacticians, had even developed a climbing and attack method specifically for those engagements. His approach emphasized positioning above the bomber stream before initiating a diving attack, thereby preserving speed and control. Against the B-17 and B-24, these methods proved effective. But the B-29 represented a new kind of enemy, one that rewrote the laws of engagement. From the moment the first B-29s appeared on radar, Japanese commanders recognized something unprecedented. These bombers operated at altitudes approaching 30,000 feet, their cruising speed exceeding 350 miles per hour, and their defensive firepower formidable. The high-altitude contrails glimmering in the winter sunlight marked not just an approaching threat, but the arrival of a new era in aerial warfare, one where altitude, technology, and endurance mattered more than maneuverability or bravery alone. The 21st Bomber Command was the most powerful air unit ever assembled in the Pacific, surpassing even the daring Doolittle raid of 1942. Within months, the force would expand to more than 1,000 aircraft distributed across 5 immense air bases on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Each B-29 embodied years of engineering breakthroughs: pressurized cabins, remote-controlled gun turrets, and fuel-efficient engines enabling round-trip missions of over 3,000 miles. The aircraft's design philosophy represented a fundamental shift in American strategic thinking. Earlier bombers, like the B-17 and B-24, lacked pressurization, forcing their crews to endure sub-zero temperatures in bulky suits and oxygen masks. Their ceilings were limited, their comfort minimal, and their endurance often tested by the elements. In contrast, the B-29's airtight fuselage created a livable environment even above 30,000 feet, allowing crews to operate in relative comfort, shirt sleeves and headsets replacing the frostbite and fatigue of earlier campaigns. For Japanese pilots like Yamada, the difference was shocking. As he climbed higher, engine performance dropped sharply. His guns froze, the controls stiffened, and his oxygen system strained to deliver breathable air. Through the thin haze, the American bombers appeared as distant silver dots, unreachable, almost serene. The Hien bucked and shuddered as Yamada tried to gain altitude, but the gap widened with every minute. In that moment, it became clear that courage alone could not close the technological gulf that separated the two nations. When the Superfortresses reached Tokyo's outskirts, the first bombs began to fall. The Musashino factory, once humming with machinery and workers, erupted into fire and debris. Japanese anti-aircraft gunners fired blindly into the thin air, their shells bursting far below the bomber formations. By the time the last American aircraft turned back toward the Pacific, Japan's defenders had barely scratched the attackers. That morning revealed more than the beginning of a new bombing campaign. It exposed the irreversible imbalance between Japan's fading wartime industry and America's advancing technological might. The age of Superfortress had arrived, and with it, a grim new reality. The home islands were no longer beyond reach. Units scrambled from Tokyo's outer fields raced for altitude as radar tracks showed the incoming silver stream. In the early assault, formations of Kawasaki K-61 Hien fighters from the 244th Sentai and Nakajima K-44 Shoki interceptors of the 47th were sent aloft from multiple bases, each climbing at the steepest sustainable rate their engines allowed. From the ground, Chiba's radar posts reported contrails slicing the sky where the American bombers advanced from the southeast. Controllers vectored defending fighters toward the plotted threat corridor, but the reality of the climb became apparent almost immediately. Many defending aircraft struggled to get much past 25,000 feet before the bombers reached their IP point. That mismatch of altitude and performance revealed itself as the intercept unfolded. The American formations operated between roughly 27,000 and 31,000 feet, changing height with local weather cells, and they arrived at those levels with a stability Japanese doctrine had not prepared them to contest. The Ki-61, for all its strengths in earlier campaigns, was essentially a medium-altitude design whose practical ceiling fell well short of the B-29's preferred operating band. Though the type's paperwork quoted a theoretical service ceiling in the mid-30s, its climb and handling deteriorated sharply above about 28,000 feet. The liquid-cooled Kawasaki engine lost power in thin air, control response slackened, and the extra weight of armor and self-sealing tanks made the climb even less forgiving. The Ki-44 interceptors from the 47th attempted to bridge the gap, but they too suffered the limits of the environment. Built to be relatively fast-climbing defenders, these fighters found themselves straining as turbochargers and oxygen systems, never designed for extended combat at such heights, reached their practical limits. Engines overheated while returning only a fraction of their rated power. Pilots labored on inadequate oxygen supplies, and as air thinned, control surfaces grew lethargic. A handful of single-seat fighters reached near bomber level, but those that did arrived with little energy to maneuver or to sustain an attack. By contrast, the B-29 Superfortresses maintained disciplined flight at their chosen altitude with systems purpose-built for the environment. Each four-engine bomber used turbocharged power plants that compressed thin air, preserving output where naturally aspirated engines would falter. Pressurized crew compartments allowed men to work in relative comfort without bulky suits, and interconnected walkways above the bomb bays enabled movement inside the aircraft at heights that would otherwise have been prohibitive. Their Norden bomb sights guided aim amid the rarefied air, while analog fire control computers coordinated defensive armament and eased the gunner's workload. On the lead bomber, the officers at the navigator's table and in the bombardier's station executed their roles with the confidence that design and training had given them. The forward crew, navigator Robert Morgan and bombardier Theodore Van Kirk among them, used the Norden system to lay the Musashino target into the run. The B-29's turbocharged engines produced sustained power figures in the thousands of horsepower, keeping true air speeds above 300 miles per hour at operational altitude and making sustained formation flight possible even in thin air. Such performance was not merely an advantage in speed or ceiling, it fundamentally altered the tactical balance. For Japanese pilots like Captain Tatsuo Yamada, the mission became an exercise in frustration, his Heian laboring near its limits while the enemy loafed above in pressurized comfort. Pre-war doctrine had trained pilots to attack from a height advantage by diving to retain energy. But on this day, reaching a position above the bombers proved unattainable. The technological gulf, turbocharging, cabin pressurization, robust high-altitude engineering, and integrated defensive systems had produced a new class of bomber operations that rendered traditional intersection techniques obsolete. The encounter exposed how advances in aircraft design and systems integration could change not only a single engagement, but the broader strategic picture of the air war. Japanese air defense tactics, refined through years of battling B-17s and B-24s flying from China at Monterey Heights, proved entirely obsolete when faced with the B-29. The first encounters exposed that gap with brutal clarity. Captain Yamada's Heian would hold 30,000 feet for only a few fleeting moments before the engine sputtered and the aircraft stalled, forcing a dive of several thousand feet to recover. Each renewed attempt ended the same way. The temperature gauges redlined, oil pressure wavered dangerously, and the fighter's energy vanished in the thin upper air. Overhead, the distant white streaks of the American formation drifted past beyond reach, their gunners tracking Japanese aircraft in their sights, but never firing because the range was simply too great. That morning, despite early warning and coordinated scramble orders, fewer than 40 Japanese interceptors managed to close to firing range at all. Most achieved only a single climbing pass before losing momentum, their bullets slowing almost immediately in the rarefied atmosphere and falling far short of their targets. The handful that reached useful distance lacked the power to stay there long enough for a second attack. Anti-aircraft gunners on the ground fared no better. Shells burst thousands of feet below the bombers even at maximum elevation, though in theory Japan's largest flak guns could reach 30,000 feet. In practice, accuracy was hopeless at such altitude. November 24, 1944 marked the beginning of a new phase of the air war, the first large-scale B-29 strike on Tokyo since the symbolic Doolittle raid 2.5 years earlier. The Superfortresses pressed on toward the Nakajima Musashino engine plant, Japan's critical center for aircraft engine production. At altitude, Lieutenant Coleman in the lead bomber released his payload on the signal. The rest of the formation followed in sequence. But the crews encountered a new atmospheric phenomenon, the high-altitude jet stream, which blew at over 200 miles per hour. The wind scattered the pattern, leaving only 24 bombers to strike the primary target while others hit secondary objectives or missed entirely. Strategically, the physical damage was modest. Psychologically, it was seismic. The bombs had fallen from heights beyond imagination, while Japanese fighters wheeled far below, powerless to interfere. Tokyo citizens and soldiers alike gazed upward at vapor trails that no defender could touch. From his command post, Lieutenant Kenji Tanaka tried to coordinate intercepts, but was soon overwhelmed by reports of engines overheating, controls locking up, and oxygen systems failing. The defenders had flown to exhaustion and returned empty-handed. Only one B-29 was lost, rammed deliberately by a crippled fighter pilot who chose suicide over failure. Japanese commanders were stunned. In a single raid, the Americans had demonstrated an altitude sanctuary unreachable by their aircraft or artillery. When the 21st Bomber Command returned to base, its losses were almost entirely mechanical, several superfortresses ditching in the Pacific due to technical issues. The Japanese, in contrast, claimed just a single kill through ramming, while the bomber gunners reported destroying 5 interceptors. In the aftermath, Japanese intelligence analysts scrambled to explain what had happened. Naval officer Minoru Genda observed the mission reports and concluded that Japan's air defenses had been built upon false assumptions. Every prior engagement with American bombers from China to Rabaul had involved aircraft operating below 25,000 feet. The concept of a pressurized turbo-supercharged bomber able to cruise above 30,000 feet had seemed theoretical, almost implausible. Now it was a devastating reality. Even the Navy's most advanced interceptors could not function effectively at such heights. Genda's report warned that defending the homeland would require an entirely new generation of aircraft or a radical shift in defensive strategy, projects for which Japan had neither time nor resources. On December 3, 1944, the Americans struck again. 86 B-29s returned to Musashino, and the Japanese adopted what little they could from the first debacle. Captain Teruhiko Kobayashi of the 244th Sentai adopted a pre-climb strategy, launching fighters early to gain maximum altitude before the bombers arrived, hoping to dive through them with momentum to spare. A few aircraft were stripped of weight, radios removed, armor plates discarded, ammunition loads cut in half. Even so, the results changed little. The modified Ki-61s gained a few hundred extra feet, but the B-29 still cruised comfortably above them, untouchable. The lessons of that winter morning were inescapable. Japan's air defense doctrine, built on courage and improvisation, had met an enemy whose technology had leapt a generation ahead. In late 1944, Japanese air defenses resorted to desperate improvisations as the superfortresses began striking the home islands from altitudes beyond established doctrine. Lieutenant Saburo Hayashi was placed in command of an ad hoc ramming squadron, volunteer pilots who accepted one-way missions rather than watch their cities burn. Aircraft assigned to Hayashi's unit were stripped to the barest minimum, radios removed, armor and most armament discarded, ammunition loads cut in half. Even so, the modified Ki-61s gained a few hundred extra feet, but the B-29 still cruised comfortably above them, untouchable. The lessons of that winter morning were inescapable. Japan's air defense doctrine, built on courage and improvisation, had met an enemy whose technology had leapt a generation ahead. In late 1944, Japanese air defenses resorted to desperate improvisations as the superfortresses began striking the home islands from altitudes beyond established doctrine. Lieutenant Saburo Hayashi was placed in command of an ad hoc ramming squadron, volunteer pilots who accepted one-way missions rather than watch their cities burn. Aircraft assigned to Hayashi's unit were stripped to the barest minimum, radios removed, armor and most armament discarded, fuel loads reduced to just enough for a single ascent and intercept. The intent was brutal and simple. Lighten the airframe to climb as high as possible, then use the aircraft itself as a last resort weapon if conventional firepower could not prevail. These modified K-61 fighters climbed at the edge of mechanical tolerance. Pilots engaged emergency boost settings and pushed manifold pressures well beyond factory recommendations. Cylinder head temperatures rose into dangerous territory, and oil pressures fluctuated unpredictably. Crews pre-breathed pure oxygen for extended periods before takeoff in an effort to blunt hypoxia. Yet the rudimentary onboard oxygen systems still proved inadequate when men strained at extreme altitude. Even in stripped configuration, most interceptors could scarcely hold 30,000 feet for more than a few brief seconds before control surfaces began to lose authority and the engine's output collapsed in the thin air. There were instances of individual daring. Sergeant Masayuki, or Masuwaki in some reports, managed to force his lightened K-61 to roughly 31,500 feet and attempted to close in on a lagging B-29.
As he zoomed upward beneath the bomber, defensive fire carved strips through his airframe. .50 caliber tracers riddled skin and fabric, yet he held his line. At the last instant, his fighter stalled some 500 feet short of the target and entered an unrecoverable spin. He eventually recovered at a lower altitude, but the aircraft had taken fatal damage and he lacked the fuel to climb again. Such desperate collisions sometimes succeeded when a bomber had mechanical trouble and descended, but systematic defense against high-altitude formations proved impossible. Through December 1944, the tally confirmed a grim pattern. B-29 losses from enemy action were negligible, while Japanese population centers began to feel strategic effects. The defenders returned to base exhausted and humiliated, reporting hot engines, frozen-up controls, oxygen shortfalls, and the helpless sensation of watching bombers pass safely overhead. For fighters steeped in a warrior ethos, the inability to intercept the attackers spawned profound frustration and shame. Many pilots described the missions as hollow victories of bravery that could not be translated into operational success. The romantic ideal of self-sacrifice clashed painfully with the cold arithmetic of high-altitude aerodynamics and engineering limits. In Washington, the U.S. 21st Bomber Command evolved rapidly. Major General Curtis LeMay assumed command in January 1945 and dissected the previous raids with a hard, methodical eye. Crews and analysts discovered that powerful high-altitude winds, the jet stream, often exceeded 200 miles per hour and regularly displaced bomb patterns by miles, making precision daytime attacks essentially futile. Cloud cover and navigation errors compounded the problem. Radar bombing in winter months produced scatter and inaccuracy. Initial statistics were damning. A very small fraction of ordnance fell on planned industrial targets. Pressure from higher headquarters mounted for more effective results. LeMay's response was decisive and radical. In March 1945, he ordered a doctrinal and tactical overhaul, abandoned the ambitious but ineffective high-altitude precision paradigm, and shift to massed, low-level nighttime incendiary raids against urban centers. B-29s were reconfigured to carry maximum loads of incendiary bomblets, defensive installations were reduced to tail protection only, and crews trained for night approaches at 5,000 to 9,000 feet rather than operating near 30,000 feet. Flying lower removed the disruptive influence of the jet stream, increased bombing density, and transformed the character of the air campaign. What had begun as a struggle against a technological ceiling became, by deliberate design, a campaign that exploited vulnerability at urban scale rather than single-target precision. The changes were immediate and consequential. By trading altitude for volume and surprise, American planners accepted higher exposure to flak and interceptors in return for devastating incendiary effects that would soon reshape the Japanese urban landscape.
The raid pattern and strategy that emerged from LeMay's calculus underscored a stark lesson of the Pacific Air War. When unforeseen technical thresholds render existing tactics impotent, operational innovation, however severe, can restore strategic momentum. The shift to low-altitude incendiary attacks marked the beginning of a new and devastating chapter in the bombing war over Japan. By the spring of 1945, the strategic complexion of the air war over Japan had changed completely. The American shift from high-altitude precision bombing to low-level night incendiary raids suddenly placed the B-29 within reach of Japanese interceptors that had previously been powerless against them. What had been a technological mismatch in the stratosphere now became a chaotic brawl in the smoky night skies above the cities. On March 9, 1945, during Operation Meeting House, the largest and deadliest air raid of the war, 334 B-29s roared toward Tokyo at altitudes between 5,000 and 9,000 feet. For the first time, every Japanese fighter type,
from the aging K-43 Oscar to the formidable K-44 Tojo, could reach the bombers with ease. However, the advantage was largely illusory. The low-level approach and darkness created confusion across Japan's fragmented air defense network. Searchlights swept the sky in disjointed cones, and radar guidance proved unreliable in the urban clutter. Lieutenant Yoshio Mitsuyoshi scrambled from Matsudo Airfield in a Nakajima K-44, finally reaching bomber altitude without straining his engine. Yet locating targets was another matter entirely. With no airborne radar and minimal radio coordination, Japanese pilots had to rely on brief glimpses of silhouetted bombers caught in searchlight beams or backlit by the inferno growing below. The air battle dissolved into isolated duels fought by instinct. Mitsuyoshi made several firing passes, seeing his tracer stream strike engines and fuselages, but the American aircraft absorbed damage and kept flying. Even when engulfed in flame, the Superfortresses refused to break formation. Their radar-directed, remote-controlled turrets spat back with eerie precision, catching attacking fighters in deadly crossfire. Below, the city was consumed. The incendiary clusters created a self-sustaining firestorm that devoured 16 square miles of Tokyo in a single night, killing an estimated 100,000 civilians and rendering 1 million homeless. It was the deadliest air attack in human history. Japanese defenders claimed 14 B-29s destroyed, their highest tally of the war, but the loss meant little against the scale of devastation. The night's outcome validated General Curtis LeMay's gamble and set the blueprint for every major raid to follow. Within days, plans for additional high-altitude interceptors were shelved. The massive investment in turbocharged engines and pressurized cockpits meant to counter unreachable bombers had become obsolete overnight. Among the first to feel the futility of this shift was Lieutenant Sadamu Komachi of the Imperial Navy, who flew the new Mitsubishi J2M Raiden during B-29 raids over Nagoya in early 1945. The Raiden's high-powered engine and supercharger theoretically allowed combat at 36,000 feet, yet in practice the aircraft faltered. Control surfaces stiffened to the point of uselessness, and the supercharged engine produced barely enough thrust to maintain speed in thin air. Even when Japanese fighters managed to reach the bomber's height, they could not turn or fire accurately. Successful attacks depended on being perfectly positioned before the American formations arrived, an almost impossible feat given radar delays and fuel limits. Pilots reported oxygen system malfunctions and disorientation, and several simply blacked out in the climb. Those few who achieved range often struck only crippled stragglers falling from formation, not the main bomber stream. As the war dragged into April, desperation took formal shape. The Imperial military organized specialized Tokotai, or special attack units, to ram the superfortresses. Corporal Koshi Ogapawa of one such group brought down both his K-61 and a B-29 over Kawasaki on April 12, 1945, in a deliberate collision. That same day, in another B-29, Staff Sergeant Henry Irwin performed an act of valor that earned him the Medal of Honor. When a phosphorus flare detonated inside his aircraft, blinding him and burning through his flesh, he carried the blazing device through the bomber and jettisoned it out a window, saving his crew. These moments, though on opposite sides of the war, reflected the shared extremity of courage that technology alone could not quantify. Japan's ramming units would destroy perhaps 10 B-29s before the war's end, an infinitesimal fraction of the bomber force, but their psychological effect was greater than their physical one. American crews, knowing enemy pilots would willingly die to strike them, faced the sky with a new, grim tension. Still, the tide was irreversible. The B-29's centralized fire control system, a marvel of analog computing, gave its gunners unmatched precision. From their pressurized compartments, operators guided remote turrets capable of tracking multiple targets simultaneously, even when the bomber itself maneuvered violently. Damaged systems could be rerouted electronically, ensuring no defensive arc went unguarded.
Japanese pilots often described the defensive accuracy as inhuman, believing they were fighting machines rather than men. By April 1945, a final development sealed Japan's aerial fate: the arrival of the long-range P-51 Mustangs from Iwo Jima. These sleek escorts swept ahead of the bomber streams, dismantling Japanese defenses before they could organize. Now, any fighter that broke through to reach the B-29s faced immediate pursuit by Mustangs eager for combat. Captain Yasuhiko Kuro's 64th Sentai, flying the new Nakajima K-84 Hayate, Japan's most advanced operational fighter, attempted to challenge the invaders. The Hayate could reach 34,000 feet and match the Mustang's speed under ideal conditions, but by then, fuel shortages, poor maintenance, and inexperienced pilots rendered even this capable machine nearly powerless to alter events. The evolution from futile climbs to suicidal ramming and finally to annihilating firebomb raids encapsulated Japan's downward spiral in the final months of the war. What began as an attempt to meet the enemy on equal technological terms ended in a grim demonstration of human endurance amid overwhelming industrial might. The skies over Japan in 1945 were not a battlefield of equals, but the stage upon which an empire's last defense and its defeat were written in flame. By mid-1945, Japan's air defenses had reached a breaking point. Despite continued attempts to refine existing fighters and develop new interceptors, the technological gulf separating Japanese aircraft from the American B-29 remained insurmountable. Lightened and stripped of excess armament, the Nakajima K-84 Hayate could climb to about 32,000 feet under ideal conditions, just shy of the bomber's cruising altitude. Pilots reported solid performance up to roughly 28,000 feet, beyond which their engines lost power rapidly. The Ha-45 engine, though reliable at medium altitudes, lacked sufficient supercharging to sustain performance in the thinner air above 30,000 feet. When B-29s descended for low-level mining runs over coastal waters, Japanese fighters finally found opportunities to strike, downing several bombers operating below 20,000 feet. These limited victories, however, underscored the grim reality. Japan's interceptors could only succeed when the altitude disadvantage was removed. In June 1945, engineers at Kawasaki introduced the K-100, a conversion of existing K-61 high-end airframes fitted with radial engines to replace their unreliable liquid-cooled counterparts. The redesign produced an aircraft that was far more dependable in combat and easier to maintain, but it came at the cost of reduced high-altitude performance. Pilots praised the K-100's agility and smooth handling at medium altitudes, where it proved competitive with American fighters. Yet its operational ceiling of roughly 32,000 feet left it helpless against the B-29's lofty sanctuary. Despite being one of Japan's finest wartime designs, it arrived too late and in too few numbers to alter the air war's outcome. Parallel efforts to field new, purpose-built high-altitude interceptors, such as the twin-engine Mitsubishi K-83 and the heavy Kawasaki K-102, showed technical promise, but were crippled by shortages of materials and precision machinery. Aluminum, high-grade steels, and advanced alloys required for superchargers and pressurization systems were nearly unobtainable by that stage of the war. Allied bombing raids further decimated production capacity. In January 1945, the Akashi Engine Works, manufacturer of the Ha-40 engine used in the K-61, was destroyed, erasing what little industrial base remained for fighter development. While Japan's aviation programs collapsed, the Americans continued refining their already dominant bomber fleet. The B-29s grew ever more capable, with new variants shedding armor and most defensive guns to maximize range and ceiling. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Tibbets oversaw a select group of crews trained for atomic bomb delivery, flying specially modified silverplate B-29s, capable of operating higher and faster than any Japanese interceptor could reach. On August 6, 1945, one of these aircraft, the Enola Gay, approached Hiroshima from 31,600 feet. Japanese radar detected the intruder and fighters scrambled to intercept. Lieutenant Matsuo Yasui, flying a K-61, climbed desperately but stalled at 29,000 feet, still 2,000 feet below the target.
Others failed to exceed even 27,000 feet. Moments later, the atomic explosion erased the city below, while the interceptors circled helplessly in the distant sky, unable to comprehend what had just occurred. 3 days later, the same tragic pattern repeated as Boxcar released the second atomic bomb over Nagasaki from 28,000 feet. Again, radar warnings came too late to matter. Japanese pilots launched, but could not reach the bomber's altitude.
In the aftermath, post-war analyses laid bare the extent of Japan's technical inferiority. Pressurized cabins allowed B-29 crews to function comfortably at altitudes where Japanese pilots struggled for consciousness. Turbo-supercharged engines delivered full power above 30,000 feet, while Japanese power plants lost more than half their efficiency in the same conditions. No amount of bravery or tactical innovation could offset this imbalance. Japanese aviators fought with remarkable skill and courage within the limitations of their machines, but engineering deficits left them powerless against the industrial might of their adversary. The lesson was unmistakable. In modern warfare, courage without technology is futile. As the war's final months unfolded, this realization permeated Japan's military leadership. General Kodachita Anami, reviewing the collapse of home defense in the closing days before surrender, recognized that altitude advantage alone had rendered Japan's geography and fighting spirit irrelevant. The B-29's ability to operate beyond the reach of interception made resistance not only hopeless, but strategically meaningless. Former Ki-61 pilot Lieutenant Naoshi Kano would later write in his memoirs of chasing shadows that lived above the sky, a haunting metaphor for the nation's futile struggle. The final months of the air war demonstrated a harsh truth that would define post-war military thought worldwide. In the age of industrial warfare, mastery of the skies depended not on valor, but on science, engineering, and the relentless momentum of technological progress. We pushed our engines to their absolute limit, the temperature needles buried deep in the red. My squadron leader's plane erupted in flames at 28,000 feet, forcing him to bail out as I kept climbing alone into thinning air. The higher I went, the less control I had. My fighter trembled unresponsive, as if frozen in place. Above me, the B-29s drifted silently across the sky like shining apparitions, untouchable, indifferent. That helplessness, the shame of failing to protect our cities, carved deeper wounds than any fear of dying ever could. From inside one of those bombers, Technical Sergeant Robert Johnson, serving as a central fire control gunner, recalled watching the Japanese fighters struggle upward through the sky. He described them as tiny black specks crawling towards us, slow and steady, until they suddenly dropped away. Some came close enough that he could see the red circles on their wings before they stalled and spiraled down like autumn leaves. A few loosed bursts of gunfire, the tracers falling short. It was hard not to feel pity, Johnson later said. They fought with heart, but heart couldn't change physics. We had altitude, armor, and power. They had courage, and courage wasn't enough. After the war, those same lessons became the foundation of Cold War strategy. The B-29 campaign taught planners that altitude was not just a defensive advantage, it was a weapon in itself. The concept of high-altitude penetration formed the backbone of nuclear bomber doctrine, leading to the development of aircraft like the B-47 and B-52 that would prowl the edges of space. American engineers refined the technologies that made such flight possible: pressurized cabins, turbo-supercharged engines, and centralized fire control systems that let crews fight comfortably in an environment where Japanese pilots had once fought for breath. In Japan, the study of captured B-29 wreckage after the surrender was both enlightening and devastating. Engineers were astonished by the complexity of the aircraft's systems. The pressurized compartments relied on advanced sealing materials Japan had never produced. Turbo-superchargers required metals and manufacturing tolerances beyond anything achievable under wartime conditions. Even the remote-controlled gun turrets used analog computing components, miniature servos, and vacuum tube circuits years ahead of Japanese military electronics. Major Toshio Sakagawa, who had commanded the elite 244th Sentai, admitted bitterly that his best pilots could do nothing against such machines. We climbed until the engines coughed and froze. We fought the air itself and lost. Our courage was real, but our defeat was mechanical. American accounts from B-29 crews paint the same picture from above. Lieutenant Marcus McDilder, a bombardier over Osaka, remembered watching the Japanese fighters claw their way upward for nearly 20 minutes, trading speed for altitude in sheer desperation. Some came close enough that he could see the red circles on their wings before they stalled and spiraled down like autumn leaves. A few loose bursts of gunfire, the tracers falling short. It was hard not to feel pity, he said. They fought with heart, but heart couldn't change physics. We had altitude, armor, and power. They had courage, and courage wasn't enough. Japanese reports from Berlin had already warned of similar problems faced by the Luftwaffe. Even Germany's most advanced piston-engine fighters struggled to reach heavy bombers above 25,000 feet. The revolutionary Me-262 jets offered brief success, but such technology remained far beyond Japan's industrial reach. Wartime scarcity, poor access to strategic materials, and relentless Allied bombing doomed any chance of matching the pace of Western innovation. Colonel John Montgomery, who led the 9th Bombardment Group from Tinian, observed that by mid-1945, the Japanese had simply stopped trying in daylight. When the B-29s descended for nighttime fire raids, Japan fought back savagely, but the outcome had already been decided months earlier, far above the clouds.
Captain Hiroshi Fujiwara, a maintenance officer with the 244th Sentai, documented the technical failures that crippled high-altitude operations. Engines overheated and seized within minutes at full power, above 25,000 feet. Oil pressure collapsed, coolant boiled, and oxygen systems failed constantly. Pilots passed out, frostbitten and gasping, sometimes never waking again. Our planes could climb, Fujiwara wrote, but they could not survive the climb. Inside the pressurized B-29s, the contrast was staggering. Staff Sergeant James Pearson, an engineer aboard several Tokyo missions, recalled checking gauges that read a cabin altitude of just 8,000 feet while cruising more than 30,000 above sea level. "We were flying in comfort," he said, while they were freezing, choking, and fighting their own machines. The gap was absolute, an unbridgeable divide between two eras of technology. What happened over Japan in 1945 was not merely an air war, but a demonstration of industrial evolution at its most ruthless. The courage of Japanese pilots was undeniable, yet courage alone could not rewrite the laws of aerodynamics or overcome the science of high-altitude flight. The skies above Japan became more than a battlefield. They became the boundary between the past and the future, a reminder that in modern war, willpower without innovation is flight without lift. Japanese radar technician Corporal Shigeru Yamamoto spent long nights watching the glowing traces of American bombers slide across his scope. The radar could detect them from hundreds of miles away, giving Japan's defenders precious minutes to prepare. But that advantage meant little when the interceptors could not climb high enough to meet the enemy. Yamamoto recalled sending out vectors, already knowing the outcome. Pilots would climb furiously, gasping for altitude, reporting peaks around 27 or 28,000 feet. Above them, at over 31,000, the B-29s cruised untouched. Their voices over the radio betrayed exhaustion and despair. "We had warning," Yamamoto later wrote, "but not the wings to reach them." As the war drew to its close, Japanese military analysis admitted what had long been obvious: the homeland's air defenses had failed. Despite early detection systems, a courageous pilot corps, and geographic advantage, Japan's industry simply could not produce machines to rival American bombers. The high-altitude raids proved unanswerable. In the final assessments, strategists conceded that the skies themselves had been lost, a technological defeat so total that resistance seemed futile. This realization quietly influenced Japan's willingness to negotiate surrender, recognizing that no amount of valor could protect its cities from destruction delivered from 30,000 feet. On August 14, 1945, Lieutenant Kuni Tanaka flew one of Japan's last interception missions. His K-100 fighter clawed upward toward a lone reconnaissance B-29, photographing the aftermath of atomic attacks. Tanaka's engine began to sputter near 28,000 feet, forcing him into descent long before contact. Above him, the American aircraft glided serenely at 35,000, completing its survey unchallenged.
That brief encounter became a fitting symbol of the war's final truth. Bravery could no longer bridge the technological abyss. From the American side, Sergeant William Atterell, a B-29 radio operator, recalled listening to Japanese fighter channels. He said we could hear their controllers giving headings, calling altitudes, directing climbs. Then came the frustration. Pilots saying their engines were overheating, they couldn't go higher. Sometimes they argued, sometimes they just went silent. What struck him most was not the enemy's hostility, but their helplessness. He said they knew where we were, but they couldn't touch us. The war had turned into a contest of machines, not men. Post-war analysis by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey confirmed this reality in cold numbers. Out of more than 30,000 sorties, only around 50 B-29s were lost to enemy fighters, a loss rate of less than 0.2%. Nearly all occurred when bombers descended from their usual altitudes due to mechanical or mission constraints. The statistics proved that height itself had become a fortress, an invisible wall beyond the reach of piston engines and propellers.
Former Imperial Navy officer Masatake Okumiya later reflected on the shock of realizing how far American technology had advanced. Japanese intelligence had estimated the B-29 ceiling at roughly 26,000 feet, based on experience with the B-17 and B-24. When the new bomber appeared cruising comfortably above 30,000, Japan's entire defensive strategy unraveled overnight. "We lacked the time and means," Okumiya wrote, "to climb into their world." Colonel Robert Robbins, a veteran B-29 pilot, explained how altitude itself became psychological armor. Knowing enemy fighters couldn't reach us changed everything. We flew steady, focused, without the nerves of constant threat. Bombardiers had perfect conditions, and crews worked without fear. Above 30,000 feet, we felt invincible. Down below, Captain Yoshiro Aoki, a Japanese fighter veteran, watched white contrails stretch across the upper atmosphere, lines of humiliation that marked every failed ascent. "We'd climb until our engines coughed," he said. "The bombers were so far above, it felt like trying to duel the moon with a sword." The relentless mismatch eroded morale more than casualties ever could. Across the Pacific, General Henry Arnold, commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces, viewed the B-29 program as vindication of America's faith in technology. Though it had cost more than the Manhattan Project, its success proved decisive. "The altitude advantage alone," Arnold noted, "justified every dollar. It gave us precision and safety that no number of soldiers could achieve." The bomber's innovations, pressurized cabins, turbo-superchargers, and centralized defensive systems would define the design philosophy of future generations of aircraft. Japanese engineer Teo Doi, one of the designers of the Ki-61, analyzed the issue with quiet resignation after the war. His fighter had been optimized for combat between 15 and 25,000 feet. "We never imagined a bomber living above 30, he wrote. "When it happened, our designs were already obsolete. To start again would take years, and time was the one thing Japan no longer possessed." Even Japan's most successful units, such as Major Teruhiko Kobayashi's 244th Sentai, could do little against the B-29s. "My men were veterans, many with dozens of victories. Yet, against the bombers, skill meant nothing. You cannot fight an enemy you cannot reach." From inside the B-29s, the difference was equally clear. Lieutenant Thomas Cartwright, a navigator, described the ease of working in a warm, pressurized cabin. "We charted courses in comfort using all our instruments freely. No masks, no frostbitten fingers, no fogged lenses. The Japanese crews were fighting their aircraft as much as they were fighting us." Even the ground defenses fared no better. Colonel Hiroshi Yamamoto, commander of several anti-aircraft units, admitted the futility of their fire. "Our guns could reach 30,000 feet on paper, but at that height, accuracy disappeared. We fired thousands of shells for every bomber hit. The sky might as well have been made of armor." Maintenance logs from Japan's remaining fighter units told the same story. Engines burned out after just a few climbs to their limits. Superchargers failed. Oxygen systems leaked, and replacement parts no longer existed. Each attempt at altitude came with a cost in both machines and men.
By war's end, the meaning of air superiority had transformed entirely. It was no longer just the courage of pilots or the sharpness of tactics. It was the mastery of engineering. The B-29 campaign revealed that the future of warfare would be written not in the dogfights of equal opponents, but in the silent, unreachable spaces where only technology could survive. Japanese aircraft maintenance crews faced a constant and exhausting battle with their own equipment. Oxygen delivery systems, critical for high-altitude flight, required relentless upkeep. Supplies of bottled oxygen and chemicals like calcium hydroxide, used to scrub carbon dioxide from cockpit air, were chronically insufficient. Each failed component grounded another aircraft, and as maintenance demands increased, the number of operational interceptors declined. It was a downward spiral that no amount of courage could reverse. From his vantage point in the tail turret, Sergeant Robert Goldsborough of the U.S. Army Air Forces had a front-row seat to Japan's struggle in the upper atmosphere. You could see them coming from miles away, he recalled, little dots growing bigger as they clawed their way upward. A few would fire long before reaching us, tracer rounds that curved upward and died out before they even got close. Others tried desperate zoom climbs, burning all their energy in one last push. For a heartbeat, they'd hang almost level with us, then drop like stones. I hardly ever had to pull the trigger. The futility was plain even from 30,000 feet away. This mismatch extended far beyond altitude. The B-29 Superfortress represented an entire ecosystem of technology Japan simply couldn't match. Its crews navigated by advanced radar and radio guidance, flew in heated, pressurized compartments, and communicated seamlessly across vast distances. Japanese aircraft, by contrast, relied on unreliable radios, often flying blind through cloud and darkness. Even their flight gear, oxygen masks, suits, and goggles lagged behind. Every flight was a contest between man and machine, and the machine usually won. Industrial disparity magnified the problem. American factories produced nearly 4,000 B-29s using precision assembly lines and rigorous quality control methods that were light years beyond Japan's reach. Japanese aviation still depended on semi-handcrafted production, vulnerable to bombing and shortages of critical alloys. Even with captured examples of U.S. equipment, engineers lacked the materials and machine tools to reproduce them. Synthetic rubbers, heat-resistant steels, and high-tolerance components simply didn't exist in Japan's collapsing industrial base. The gap was no longer one of tactics, but of civilization's mechanical limits. Desperation led to increasingly extreme countermeasures. Lieutenant Commander Masahiko Kawamoto, who led special attack units against B-29 formations near Nagoya, remembered constant tactical improvisation. "We tried everything: night attacks, coordinated head-on charges, even deliberate ramming. Each time they adapted faster than we did. When we managed to disrupt their night missions, they shifted back to daylight raids at altitudes we couldn't touch. Every new idea died in the air." The B-29's design reflected a revolutionary philosophy. Boeing engineers had built it not merely as a bomber, but as a strategic system, a fusion of technology, endurance, and altitude dominance. Its pressurized fuselage allowed crews to operate comfortably where human life should have been impossible. Its range stretched across entire oceans, enabling strikes from remote island bases. Defensive fire control used centralized analog computing, granting overlapping protection without sacrificing speed or altitude.
It was the first aircraft to turn altitude itself into armor. The technological legacy of the B-29 would outlive the war. Its systems for pressurization and turbo-supercharging directly informed the first generation of post-war airliners. The bomber's remote-control gun turrets laid the groundwork for modern fly-by-wire systems. What began as a tool of destruction became a blueprint for the jet age, a transition from wartime necessity to peacetime innovation that shaped global aviation. For Japan's airmen, however, these advances came too late. Captain Kazuo Unoda, who commanded a K-84 squadron during the final months of the war, described the emotional toll. Below 25,000 feet, our planes could fight on even terms. Above that, we might as well have been insects chasing the sun. Pilots came back without firing a single shot. They weren't just defeated, they were broken. Strategically, the B-29 campaign proved the ultimate vindication of American air doctrine. High-altitude immunity allowed for systematic destruction of Japan's industrial infrastructure without catastrophic losses. Precision bombing, once theoretical, became a practical instrument of total war. The atomic missions over Hiroshima and Nagasaki represented the final expression of that doctrine, air power as a self-contained force capable of ending wars outright. In the closing weeks of 1945, Japan's senior commanders could no longer ignore what the wreckage around them confirmed. The nation's technological foundations were obsolete. Factories lay in ruins, engineers lacked raw materials, and production lines had ceased to function. Emperor Hirohito, briefed on the situation, reportedly understood the futility. Without the means to repel high-altitude raids, continued fighting would only invite annihilation. In the end, the surrender was not just military, it was technological. The skies had become the final battlefield, and in that domain, Japan could not fight. The B-29 had rendered courage irrelevant and rewritten the meaning of victory through engineering alone. Chief Master Sergeant Frank Morrison, a veteran of the Pacific Air Campaign, oversaw the intricate systems that kept the B-29 Superfortress flying at the edge of human capability. The bomber's pressurization assemblies, though mechanically demanding, rarely failed when handled with precision. Its turbo-superchargers, delicate yet powerful, sustained thrust at heights where Japanese engines could barely breathe. Each component reflected an immense foundation of science, industry, and manufacturing discipline. Morrison later reflected that victory in the air had less to do with bravery or numbers than with the industrial civilization that made such machinery possible. Across the battlefield, Lieutenant Jiro Tanaka, a Ki-61 pilot, faced a far crueler reality. Every interception attempt was a physical ordeal, his oxygen mask freezing over, his fingers losing feeling on the controls, and his lungs straining even as his aircraft staggered upward. The thin air made simple maneuvers feel like fighting underwater. When his instruments failed and his canopy fogged, he could only watch the silver bombers drift unchallenged above him, their contrails crossing the sky while Tokyo and Osaka burned below. "We were not defeated in spirit, but by the limits of our machines," he would later write. The humiliation was not personal, it was national. The roots of that defeat lay deep in America's wartime industrial mobilization. The B-29 program alone consumed more resources than Japan's entire wartime aviation effort. Its production lines operated with machine tolerances that Japanese factories, still relying on hand-fitting and manual assembly, could not match. Precision machining, specialized alloys, and extensive quality control ensured that every bomber rolled off the line nearly identical in performance, a concept foreign to Japanese manufacturers struggling under shortages and bombing raids. The United States had turned engineering into a weapon and mass production into strategy. General Curtis LeMay exploited this technological dominance with ruthless efficiency. When high-altitude operations proved inefficient for incendiary raids, he reversed tactics entirely, sending B-29s at low altitude by night, guided by radar and protected by darkness rather than altitude. Even stripped of their sanctuary, the bombers maintained their supremacy through superior equipment, coordination, and overwhelming numbers. Japan's defenses, fragmented and technologically outclassed, could not adapt fast enough. By war's end, LeMay had demonstrated that strategy meant nothing without the tools to execute it. The campaign fundamentally altered the understanding of air power. It proved that industrial and technological superiority could replace manpower as the foundation of military success. The B-29's range, altitude, and adaptability allowed the U.S. to project destruction on a continental scale without invading. Every future concept of strategic deterrence, from the early nuclear bomber fleets to the missile age, traced its lineage to these missions. Technology, not terrain, not tactics, had become the decisive element of war. In post-war analyses, historians and engineers alike recognized the campaign as the turning point where engineering overtook valor as the determinant of victory. Japanese pilots displayed exceptional courage, and their commanders constantly experimented with new tactics. Yet courage, innovation, and sacrifice could not compensate for the absence of pressurized cabins, turbo-supercharged engines, or the metallurgical capacity to build them. The so-called altitude sanctuary of the B-29 was not a tactic, but a manifestation of industrial superiority, a barrier no amount of bravery could cross. Ultimately, the skies above Japan told a story written as much in blueprints as in blood. The outcome of the air war was decided not by dogfights or heroic duels, but by the assembly lines of Wichita and Seattle, where the United States transformed knowledge into dominance. The lessons drawn from that victory shaped decades of military doctrine, that the true battlefield of the modern age lies not only in the air, but in the laboratories and factories that make flight and supremacy possible.